Hi everyone, and welcome to the first Unnecessary Detail review of Final Fantasy. The purpose of the series is to go unnecessarily in-depth into games while covering every single detail that I possibly could. And dear God, as I am writing this script, I realize how much research is going to be involved. And just a quick ground rule for the series, I'm not going to go in-depth into things that I find irrelevant, or go in-depth onto just very minor details, or go over a historical track record of, for example, what Square released before releasing Final Fantasy. I am going to mention some of the more notable titles, but for now, I'm just going to be sticking with just the most notable, at least. So to begin, we are first going to start with the Final Fantasy series. Starting with the first one, chronologically I mean. I am unsure where Type 0 fits in due to the number 0 in its name, but we will figure that out along the way. So to begin, in September 1983, Masafumi Miyamoto founded Square as a software subsidiary of Denyu-sha, an electric power conglomerate owned by his father, Kunichi Miyamoto. Driven by his disinterest in following his father's footsteps in the electricity business, Miyamoto instead joined Denyu-sha's software division, where he shifted his focus to the booming video game market of the time. And just to give an idea, the most popular games at the time were Mario Bros, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong Jr., Spy Hunter, where I just noticed in the script I said Soy Hunter, and Q*bert. Q*bert? During this period, Miyamoto wanted to go against the status quo, where video games in Japan were typically developed by a single programmer. He believed that keeping up with advances in computing and video game development required a collaborative effort involving graphic designers, programmers, and professional story writers. At the time, the original offices for Square were based in a former hairdresser salon. To recruit programmers with exceptional skill, Miyamoto organized a salon in Yokohama where those that demonstrated exceptional programming skill were offered jobs. This led to the part-time hiring of Hironobu Sakaguchi, Hiromichi Tanaka, as well as Square future CEO Hisashi Suzuki. When they began, the first game Square tried to produce was an adaptation of a Japanese game show called Tourin Ingen, but due to licensing issues, the game got canned. Just for those interested, I tried looking this game show up but kept coming up empty. The closest I could find was a Reddit post also asking where they can find information on this show. Then, during October 31st, 1981, Square released its first completed game for PC called The Death Trap, which was a text-adventure game where the plot revolves around a spy in a war-torn African country during the 1980s, which was successful enough to warrant a sequel, Will the Death Trap 2. Then 4 years later, in 1985, Square entered a licensing agreement with Nintendo to develop titles for the Famicom, which was short for Family Console, where the first title they released for the console was Thexter. Thexter. Very interesting name. A run-and-gun game where you pilot a transforming robot of the same name through 15 stages until you come to the central computer where you destroy it to save the planet. Yeah, I didn't look too much into this game, but if you want to look more into it, feel free. A year later, in September 1986, Square separated from Denyu-sha and became an independent company, Square Co. Limited. When they separated, they moved to new offices that were based in Ginza, where during the period it was considered one of the most expensive areas for a company to operate. Hironobu Sakaguchi, who was the director of planning and development of the company at that point, speculated that Miyamoto was trying to attract businesses by trying to appear to be successful. Also, just for interest's sake, when Final Fantasy was celebrating its 35th anniversary, there was a special interview held with 3 of Final Fantasy's developers. Of these 3, Hironobu Sakaguchi was amongst them, and just hearing him talk about how his experience was when they moved to the Ginza offices, he is a very entertaining storyteller, let me just say that. You should probably watch the interview. I'll put a link of it in the description because it is an extremely interesting video and interview to watch, especially when they go over the experiences. A lot of the information was also taken from this interview with him.
こちらは1987年12月18日発売で、まだスクエアの所在地が銀座でした。はい。ここから
一番リッチだった頃ですね。
そうですか。
はい。何歳か社長が土地狂って銀座行くぞって銀座3丁目ね。
いや
3丁目の東銀座
東銀座4丁目だから
ほぼ4丁目ですね。
歌舞伎座に近い。
はい。
そのリッチな中、我々は夏は こう徹夜明けの酸っぱい匂いのする T シャツ短パン、ゴム草履で
それは坂口さんだけだと思う。
いやみんなそうだったよ。
いや
で銀座松屋とかに行くと、奥様方が、
はい
誰この人たちっていうだからここでしか飯食えないしならっていう
ちょっとね銀座の街もね今よりももっと華やかだったんですよね。
そうだね。
もう
Now let's go back to the story. During this period, Square would go on to produce several unsuccessful titles one after the other, and coupled with the high rent cost of the Ginza offices, Square was forced to move into the smaller offices in Okachamichi in the Ueno area of Taito, I cannot speak Japanese to save my life, in Tokyo in 1987. And according to the developers that were on the interview, the Ginza offices costed 20 million yen a month just for renting, or $125,000 at the time. And in Okachamichi, the offices were around 2 million or 12.5 thousand US dollars.
こちらは1988年12月17日発売で、スクエアが御徒町に、引っ越しました。この頃1からガラッと変わりましたよね。2って
御徒町ですもんね。
御徒町の影響強いですか？
やっぱり銀座でそっから家賃すっごい高かったんですよ。
そうでしょうね。
月ね、2000万とかしたんだよな、当時で。それで御徒町は200万、月200万です。
そこまで
10分の1で落ちましたね。いや
すごい地味な雑居ビルですね。
いや結構隙間風とか吹いてたよね。
At one point, Miyamoto then asked the company's 4 directors to give game proposals, intending to have the staff vote on the best idea. Sakaguchi proposed developing a role-playing game, or RPG, believing it to be a promising project following the success of Enix's RPG called Dragon Quest. Before Square Enix became Square Enix, Square and Enix were separate companies and they were competitors of one another. But we'll get into that a bit later, maybe in the next video, because as far as I understand, they haven't really joined or merged at any point during the development of Final Fantasy I. Miyamoto was skeptical of the idea, but accepted the proposal for the production of the game on the condition that it only had a 5-person team. On these conditions, the game was developed by Sakaguchi, Iranian-American programmer Nazir Gabelli, Akitoshi Kawazu, Koichi Ishii, and Nobuo Uematsu. At one point during development, they eventually received help from another Square team led by Hiromichi Tanaka, which included a newcomer debugger, Hiroyuki Ito. This led to the development of Final Fantasy. Before we move any further, I just want to actually talk about the name Final Fantasy because there seems to be a lot of disagreement as well as conflicting information on the. So I'm just going to present what I think on it, at least from what I found. So to begin, the name Final Fantasy was in a way inspired by a board game called Fighting Fantasy. And at the time, Dragon Quest was popular and was often shortened to Dracue, which was, a shortened version of Dragon and Quest. They wanted something similar, and so for their game, they wanted it to be shortened using the Roman alphabet. Thus, they settled on FF, where they were still determining what FF would stand for. Initially, it was planned to be called Fighting Fantasy, but again, there already was a fighting fantasy that existed and was trademarked. Thus, they went with Final Fantasy as a sort of last resort. And even when you're watching Sakaguchi and the other developers talking about this, they seem like it was just like something they came up with casually.
ですけれども、ファイナルファンタジーというネーミングの由来もちょっと伺ってもよろしいですか？名前の由来でちょっと。
名前のやつね。最初ね、これね、あまりかっこいい話じゃなくて、ファイティングファンタジーだったんですね。ただドラゴンクエストが当時ドラクエって呼ばれて、略されてやっぱり世の中にもう一作目が定着しかけていたんで、やっぱ僕たちは略された時にアルファベットにしたいねっていうのがあったんです。だから FF ありきです。
FF がもうじゃあ
もう最初からあって、でファイティングファンタジーで、ちょっとそれはいろいろ商標とかねいろいろあるじゃないですか。ちょっと無理だねってことで。仕方なくファイナルファンタジーファイナルでいいんじゃねみたいな
割と軽い気持ちでファイナルが来たんですね。
There is an urban legend surrounding this where the final meant that it was Sakaguchi's final game and that he would leave game development permanently if the game was unsuccessful. But when you watch the interview, Sakaguchi did not make any mention of this. Sakaguchi mentions that a primary school teacher wrote Final Fantasy on the board and explained that it means Kyokoku no Genso, or the ultimate illusion in Japanese. Sakaguchi then received a postcard from the class about this and was immediately sold on this and immediately presented it as the lost illusion, as the meaning for Final Fantasy.
ところによるとなんか最後の夢だったり究極幻想っていう解釈とかいろんな都市伝説があって、
どっかの小学校の国語の先生か、英語の先生かな、が黒板に「ファイナルファンタジー」と書いて、これは究極の幻想だ、
かっこいい
ってその生徒に言ったらしいんですよ。その生徒さんがはがきかな当時だから。でそういう先生から教わったんですけど「そうですか」っていうのが来た瞬間、これ使おうと思って。今日からみんな悪いけど最後の幻想だからね、みんなそういう気持ちで言ってよっていう。そうだよ。
やっぱりじゃあファンの方ありきというかね。
いやいや、もうその先生にはもう感謝でございます。はいはい。
The development of Final Fantasy took around 10 months, and initially they were planning to ship 200,000 units. But Sakaguchi managed to persuade Square to double that number. When the game was then released in 1987, they managed to sell over 400,000 copies in Japan. And furthermore, they saw greater sale numbers in North America when released in 1989 in that region, where it sold over 700,000 copies.